Chapter 190 Black Boots. Because Feng Yue had originally been standing, apart from that pair of boots, there was nothing else on the floor. The storage pouches Han Li had in mind disappeared without a trace. Han Li stood straight like a carp jumping on water, and then, as if his buttocks were on fire, he hurriedly charged over. After searching for a great long while in the area where Feng Yue disappeared, he couldn't find the slightest trace of the storage pouch. Could it be that the power of the heavenly lightning seed was so powerful? Did it actually turn the storage pouch into ashes along with the person? After Han Li searched his surroundings with his hands several times, he eventually came to an extremely depressing answer. Unresigned, Han Li expanded the search area by several times, but the result was the same. However, he was actually able to acquire the rich girl's small mirror and crystal ball. Furthermore, because the owner had already died, he was able to recover the small blade treasure talisman. When Han Li saw these three items, he thought that the loss of his Heaven's Lightning Child, the high-quality magic tools, the silver hook, and the azure rope, as well as the storage pouches that were destroyed by the heavenly lightning seed, he looked up to the sky speechlessly. However, regardless of what was said after this great battle, he was nonetheless the winner against the much stronger Feng Yue, who had turned to dust. Not knowing whether to consider it a profit or a loss, Han Li was only able to mock himself. When he thought of Feng Yue, Han Li unconsciously looked at what was left at him, a pair of halved legs. He could not help but lightly shake his head. He then lifted his hand, releasing two fist-sized fireballs straight toward them. Since this person was already dead, he naturally must thoroughly dispose of the legs to prevent others from discovering this. Who knew what others' troubles could arise? Peng peng. The flames immediately covered them. In the blink of an eye, aside from those jet-black boots, everything else had turned to ash. Satisfied, Han Li nodded his head and turned around, thinking to depart. Boots? How strange. How could normal boots come out unscathed from my fireballs? Just as Han Li took a small step to leave, he immediately saw his mistake and hurried to turn around. He looked toward those seemingly ordinary boots with an odd expression. With a careful look, Han Li was unable to discover anything irregular. Not only were these boots not destroyed by the fireballs, but they also didn't have a single trace of being burned. Furthermore, they faintly released slight spiritual ripples. Magic tool? Han Li asked with great bewilderment. He hesitated for a moment and walked several steps over, lowering his head and picking up the pair of black boots, light and soft, but they are still very tough. They shouldn't be cloth or silk boots. They seem to have been made from the hide of an animal. Han Li concluded after stroking the boots for a while. Because he was close to them, Han Li was able to feel the boots' faint spiritual qi. They were certainly magic tools. In addition, they were likely to have been constructed from demonic beast leather. Seeing these leather boots, Han Li faintly thought of something. He somewhat impatiently took off his cloth shoes and exchanged them for these leather boot magic tools. They were very comfortable and soft, as if there was nothing there. This was what Han Li first thought when he wore those boots. He carefully observed the boots after wearing them for a while. So far, nothing extraordinary had occurred. Wrinkling his brow, Han Li took a small step. Hachi. Han Li's body suddenly blurred and appeared over 3 meters away, light as a feather. Imperial flight technique. No, it's much quicker than the Imperial flight technique. Han Li thought, pleasantly surprised. At this moment, Han Li finally knew the secret behind Feng Yue's incomparably fast and nimble movements. It was probably because of these boots that he was able to move so strangely and as quick as lightning. Wearing these boots, Han Li started slowly walking on the ground, gradually familiarizing himself with the boots' performance. He gradually grew faster and faster, finally making use of shifting smoke steps to speed up. Before, Han Li's fastest movements had been able to make his body blur, even causing afterimages to remain. After he put on these boots, Han Li became even faster, causing several identical phantoms to appear simultaneously, all using the same movements and all with the same smile. However, when all of the phantoms simultaneously and gradually converged, Han Li stood there at the center. Motionless, Han Li stood blankly at his original location as if he were pondering about something, but he then howled with laughter and continued to laugh until tears were flowing out. After he laughed for a long while, Han Li bent his waist and flashed with an azure light. His entirety turned into an azure wind and actually disappeared into air without a trace. At this moment, the entire place was extremely quiet. Apart from the occasional rustling of the wind, there were no other sounds. A burst of rumbling sounds suddenly sounded out. The nearby trees suddenly started to break apart in a strange manner from the center. The cuts were clean and smooth, making the trees resemble the flat of a mirror. However, it was clear that there wasn't a single person in sight. The speed at the trees breaking grew quicker and quicker. A short moment later, all that remained of the trees within 100 meters were tree stumps. At this moment, Han Li, enveloped in a faint azure light, appeared with a brow filled with sweat. However, he was faintly smiling and was unable to conceal the joy on his face. Shifting smoke steps, leather boot magic tools, along with the Imperial flight technique, actually caused Han Li to become so fast that he was able to temporarily break away from the sight of an ordinary person's naked eye, as if he had become invisible, disappearing without a trace. According to Han Li's estimates, even an outstanding cultivator with the aid of the Heaven's Eye technique would only be able to see a faint glimpse of him by exerting all their strength. If they didn't use a defensive magic technique, Han Li would be a great threat. Currently, so long as Han Li concentrated and a person was within an area of about 10 meters away, even if it was a distance of 100 meters, it would take Han Li at most a single breath to reach them. Naturally, this speed exceeded the limits of the human body. Han Li was only able to maintain the speed for a short amount of time. If he maintained it for too long, his entire body would break down. After all, such high-speed movements were extremely stressful on Han Li's body. However, it was already fast enough for him to kill the opponent several times. Especially if it were a situation where he used the thread magic tool, his power would increase many times over. Han Li lowered his head. With a sigh, he caressed the leather boots on his feet for a long while. He felt that this item was extremely suited for him. Even if someone wanted to use some treasure talisman to exchange for them, he wouldn't even consider it. With his confidence increased several times over, Han Li excitedly looked around in every direction. When he saw the corpse of the yellow-clothed woman, he lightly sighed and used a fireball to blast open a hole. He buried the woman's body extremely crudely. That was to the limit of what Han Li could do. After he finished this, Han Li's figure flashed and disappeared into the forest. He currently wanted to hurry towards the central area. However, Han Li did not know that after the massacre of the first day that the disciples spent in the forbidden area, only 70 disciples from the various sects remained. Less than half of those who had entered the forbidden area remained. The majority of these were the elite disciples of each sect, and they had all promptly arrived near the central area, preparing and waiting idly for the second day's great purge. Those they believed to be weak had all been mercilessly eliminated one by one. Of course, the rich girl and the heavenly Imperial Fortress disciple Feng Yue who had been killed by Han Li were among those who had participated in the slaughter. However, they were now dead, naturally disappearing without a trace.